The night Rome learned to fear silence, on a winter night in 39 AD, Rome held its breath. Not because of frost or storm, but because every family knew what darkness now meant. Streets that once echoed with laughter fell quiet as oil lamps dimmed behind shuttered windows. Mothers whispered prayers they did not believe would be answered. Fathers stood rigid, listening for footsteps that might stop at their door. In those hours, Rome learned a new truth. The empire that ruled the world could no longer protect its own children. The emperor had changed the rules, and fear had become law. A sound always came first. Heavy boots striking stone in steady rhythm. Armored men moving without urgency, because resistance no longer existed. When the guards stopped, they did not knock. They placed a lantern wrapped in red cloth at the doorway, a signal known only to those who had already learned what it meant. The light bled softly onto the street, like a wound that refused to close. Inside the house, time slowed. A mother would reach for her daughter's hand. A father would straighten his back, as if dignity might still matter. And the girl, often no more than 14 or 15, would understand that her life had just been divided into before and after. Rome had always told itself that service to the emperor was an honor. Noble families raised their daughters, believing proximity to power meant safety. That lie shattered on nights like this. The Palatine Hill did not summon daughters to celebrate them. It took them. Once chosen, a girl vanished from public life. Her name might still be spoken at dinner tables, but softly, and only for a time. Soon, even that became dangerous. Silence was safer. Forgetting was survival. At the center of this fear stood one man, Gaius Caesar, known to history as Caligula. Rome once loved him. When he first took the throne, crowds cheered until their throats burned. They saw in him the son of Germanicus, the golden general, the promise of a kinder age after years of suspicion and executions under Tiberius. For a brief moment, it seemed the gods had listened. Then something shifted. What Rome mistook for illness was something deeper, something that had been growing quietly for years. Caligula did not invent cruelty overnight. It had been taught to him slowly, carved into him by loss and terror. As a child, he watched his family destroyed not by enemies, but by the state itself. He learned early that love offered no protection and that power answered only to itself. On the island of Capri, under the watchful eyes of Tiberius, he discovered another lesson. Survival required obedience, silence, and the ability to hide one's true thoughts behind a smile. Those lessons did not fade when he became emperor. They transformed. Now, with absolute authority, Caligula began to test how far power could reach. He blurred the line between religion and command, between ritual and desire. What he created was not chaos, but a system one wrapped in sacred language and imperial privilege. Rome told itself these were isolated incidents, misunderstandings, rumors exaggerated by fear. But the red lanterns kept appearing, and with each one, the city learned that something ancient and forbidden had been revived behind palace walls. That night, one girl named Flavia waited as her mother whispered her name. She did not yet know what the Garden of Venus was, or why history would try to erase it. She only knew that the guards were at the door, and that whatever awaited her inside the palace would make the darkness outside feel merciful. And as she stepped forward, Rome took another step toward a truth it would later pretend never existed. The emperor who was made, not born long before Rome learned to fear his name, Caligula was a child moving through a world soaked in blood and suspicion. He was born into glory, the son of Germanicus, the most beloved general Rome had known in generations. Soldiers would fall silent when Germanicus spoke. Cities erupted in celebration when he arrived, and the empire saw in him a future built on honor and restraint. Caligula should have inherited that legacy. Instead, he inherited its destruction. His earliest memories were not of tutors or marble halls, but of marching camps where iron ruled everything, where discipline was survival, and where mercy was weakness disguised as virtue. As a boy, he walked between hardened legionaries, wearing a child-sized version of their armor, tiny boots striking the ground in imitation of war. The soldiers laughed and called him Caligula, Little Boot, a nickname meant as affection. Yet even in those moments of praise, the foundations of his mind were forming in a brutal landscape. He learned that authority commanded love only as long as it remained strong. He learned that fear was more reliable than loyalty. And most importantly, he learned that men followed power, not morality. These lessons settled deep inside him, quietly reshaping the boy who watched men kill and die without question. Then the empire turned on his family. Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances, and Rome mourned while the palace calculated. Caligula's mother and brothers were accused, exiled, imprisoned, and executed one by one. There were no trials that mattered, no justice that answered. The state simply erased them. Caligula watched everything he loved vanish, not through war, but through whispers, decrees, and sealed orders. It was in that moment he learned the most corrosive truth of all. Rome did not need enemies to destroy you. It only needed permission. What followed was Capri, an island Rome imagined as a peaceful retirement for Emperor Tiberius, but which functioned as something far darker. Capri was a palace without mercy, a place where paranoia ruled and cruelty wore the mask of tradition. Caligula lived there for years under constant surveillance, sharing space with the man responsible for annihilating his family. Every day was a performance. Every word had to be chosen carefully. Every emotion had to be buried. He learned to smile when threatened, to bow when humiliated, and to survive by becoming invisible. Capri taught him that silence was power, and that those who controlled fear controlled everything. These years did not break Caligula. They refined him. The rage he could not express turned inward, fermenting into something colder and more precise. He studied how authority functioned when stripped of compassion. He observed how religion, ritual, and imperial decree could be fused into tools of domination. He understood that Rome's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness, its reverence for tradition. If cruelty was wrapped in sacred language, people would accept it. If abuse was framed as divine will, it would be obeyed. When Tiberius died and Caligula ascended the throne, Rome believed it was witnessing rebirth. Celebrations filled the streets, sacrifices were offered, and hopes were raised high. But the man who emerged was not the golden child they remembered. He was the product of loss, terror, and enforced silence. The empire did not realize it yet, but the lessons learned on Capri were about to be unleashed. And the first to pay the price would not be generals or senators, but Rome's daughters, offered to power through rituals history would later struggle to explain away. The garden that never appeared on maps, the Garden of Venus, was never marked on any Roman plan, never carved into marble, never described openly by poets who praised every other excess of the Palatine. It existed in the space Rome reserved for things it did not wish to name. Hidden behind layers of courtyards and sealed corridors, the chamber was designed to look sacred rather than cruel, a calculated deception meant to quiet the conscience of those who served there. Marble columns rose like witnesses that refused to speak. Torches cast a honeyed glow that softened shadows, and incense burned thick enough to blur the line between ritual and reality. To outsiders, it was said to be a private sanctuary dedicated to Venus, a place where the emperor honored the goddess of love. Those who entered knew the truth was far darker. Caligula understood something his predecessors had only hinted at. Rome obeyed violence, but it worshipped tradition. By wrapping his desires in the language of religion, he transformed personal cruelty into imperial ceremony. The girls brought into the garden were told they had been chosen, that the goddess favored them, that their families would be blessed for generations. Priests repeated ancient phrases stripped of meaning, while attendants dressed the victims in ceremonial garments meant to resemble brides. Everything was staged to feel inevitable, as if resisting would offend the gods themselves. In this way, terror was dressed as destiny, and submission was reframed as honor. For the families left behind, the experience was worse than public execution. A daughter taken by decree could not be mourned properly. No funeral rites were allowed, because officially nothing had been lost. The girl still lived, somewhere beyond reach, transformed into something unnamed. Mothers were expected to accept this with gratitude. Fathers were expected to remain silent. Any sign of protest invited suspicion, and suspicion in Caligula's Rome was a death sentence. The city learned to swallow its grief and present obedience as loyalty. Even as whispers spread through bathhouses and marketplaces, half-formed stories of girls who returned changed, broken, or not at all. Ancient writers who dared to hint at the garden did so carefully. They described strange ceremonies, unusual privileges, sudden disappearances among noble households, then stopped. Sentences broke off. Names vanished. Later copies of their texts show signs of alteration, lines scratched out, sections missing. Historians believe this was not coincidence, but survival. To write too clearly was to invite erasure, either of the text or of the writer. Rome did not deny the garden existed. It simply made it impossible to prove. Silence became the official record. Inside the palace, Caligula watched this silence grow and understood its power. Each ritual reinforced his authority, not only over bodies, but over memory itself. He was not content to rule Rome. He wanted to redefine what Rome would remember. By forcing the elite to participate, even passively, he bound them to his crimes. Everyone who knew became complicit. Everyone who remained silent became safe, at least for a time. The garden thrived in this moral vacuum, nourished by fear and reverence in equal measure. And yet, beneath the incense and ceremony, something began to shift. Too many disappearances, too many altered lives, too many broken households. Rome was starting to sense that what was happening behind palace walls was not divine favor, but systematic destruction. The question was no longer whether the garden existed, but how long the city could pretend it did not. And as unease spread through the capital, Caligula prepared to push the ritual further, transforming private horror into a public instrument of control, unaware that the silence he relied on was beginning to fracture. When marriage became a sentence in Caligula's Rome, marriage was no longer a union between families or a promise of stability. It became a sentence passed quietly, often without warning, and carried out behind locked doors draped in silk and incense. Noble households began to understand a grim pattern forming beneath the surface of imperial favor. To be beautiful, well-born, or closely connected to the Senate was no longer an advantage. It was an invitation. Daughters raised to believe their value lay in alliances, and honor discovered that their status placed them closer to danger, not safety. The palace watched these families carefully, and when the moment came, the emperor's interest was framed not as desire, but as destiny. Caligula revived and distorted older customs, taking fragments of ancient rites and reshaping them into tools of domination. He declared certain women symbolically married, to him or to the gods, a legal and religious fiction that stripped them of autonomy without ever requiring public acknowledgement. Once declared sacred property, a woman could no longer refuse, could no longer belong to her family, and could no longer exist in ordinary society. This transformation happened overnight, often announced through sealed messages delivered by officials who spoke softly and offered hollow congratulations. Resistance was unthinkable. Refusal was treason disguised as piety. For the women themselves, the psychological torment eclipsed physical fear. They were instructed to accept their role with reverence, taught prayers meant to suppress panic, and surrounded by attendants trained to enforce obedience with gentle cruelty. Everything was designed to isolate them from their former lives. Mirrors were covered, letters forbidden, names replaced with titles that erased individuality. They were told their suffering served Rome, that their silence preserved order, that their submission pleased divine forces older than the empire itself. In reality, they had become instruments through which Caligula tested how completely power could overwrite identity. Families learned quickly that grief had to be controlled. Public mourning risked imperial attention. Private sorrow had to be hidden behind banquets and smiles. Mothers who once oversaw household rituals now burned offerings in secret, hoping for daughters who might never return. Fathers who held political office discovered that influence meant nothing when weighed against imperial obsession. Even senators bowed their heads and offered thanks, because to do otherwise would expose not only themselves, but every woman connected to their bloodline. Caligula's system was precise. It punished not just victims, but potential dissenters. What made this era particularly terrifying was how normalized it became. Over time, Rome adjusted, conversations shifted, expectations lowered. A girl disappearing into the palace was no longer shocking. It was inevitable. This was Caligula's true victory. He did not need mass executions or public terror. He taught the elite to police themselves, to sacrifice their own in the name of survival. By the time whispers reached the streets, the damage was already embedded deep within the social fabric. Yet beneath this forced acceptance, something dangerous was growing. Discontent does not vanish simply because it is forbidden. It accumulates silently in memory and resentment. Even as Rome outwardly complied, the moral weight of these acts pressed heavier with each passing ritual. The emperor believed he had perfected control, that fear wrapped in tradition would last forever. He did not yet see that by turning marriage into a sentence, he had begun transforming private suffering into collective guilt. And guilt, once shared widely enough, becomes the seed of collapse. Why the records go silent at a certain point, the story stops being told. This is not coincidence, and it is not the result of lost time alone. When historians search the surviving records of Caligula's reign, they encounter something far more unsettling than condemnation or praise. They encounter absence. Accounts that begin with confidence suddenly fracture. Names appear once and never again. Events are hinted at, then swallowed by vague language or abrupt transitions. It is as if the past itself recoiled from what it had recorded and chose to look away. This silence is not empty. It is deliberate. Roman historians were not naive observers. Men like Seneca, Suetonius, and later Tacitus understood how power punished truth. They had lived through purges, watched colleagues vanish, and learned how easily ink could become a death warrant. When they wrote of Caligula, they described madness, cruelty, excess, but often stopped short of specifics when it came to women and ritual. Instead of clear descriptions, they used implication, moral outrage without detail, or carefully worded accusations that left room for denial. Modern scholars believe this was a form of self-preservation. To write plainly would have implicated not only the emperor, but the entire ruling class that enabled him. Inscriptions tell a similar story. Stone tablets commissioned during this period show unusual patterns. Titles are carved without names. Dedications lack recipients. Entire sections appear deliberately smoothed down, as if erased after completion. Archaeologists have found evidence that some texts were altered decades later, suggesting an organized effort to reshape memory after Caligula's assassination. The Senate officially condemned him, ordering statues destroyed and names struck from public monuments. But this was not justice. It was containment. By blaming everything on one dead man, Rome protected itself from confronting how deeply complicit it had been. The women themselves rarely appear in the historical record at all. Their voices were never preserved. Their experiences were not documented. If they survived, they did so in silence, because speaking would have meant social ruin or worse. If they did not, their absence was explained away as illness, relocation, or divine calling. Rome was skilled at crafting acceptable narratives. It preferred myths to accountability, ritual to reflection. And so the Garden of Venus faded into rumor, then into nothing at all. What makes this silence so powerful is that it worked. For centuries, Caligula was remembered as a mad tyrant, a spectacle of excess and instability. The focus remained on his cruelty toward senators, his insults to the gods, his financial ruin of the state. The women disappeared from the story, reduced to footnotes or ignored entirely. History became safer that way, easier to digest, easier to condemn without discomfort. But silence leaves traces. Modern historians have learned to read what is missing as carefully as what remains. When patterns repeat, when entire categories of experience vanish from the record, absence becomes evidence. The truth historians are now willing to face is this: Rome did not forget these rituals because they were insignificant. It buried them because remembering would have required admitting how fragile morality becomes when power is absolute. And as the last surviving hints of the garden surface, through archaeology and fragmented texts, one question grows harder to ignore. If Rome erased this once, how many other truths has history learned to hide by simply refusing to speak? The cost of absolute power. When Caligula finally fell, Rome told itself a comforting story. The emperor was dead, assassinated by the very guards meant to protect him, and with his death, order would return. The Senate rushed to condemn his memory, declaring him a monster, a madman, an aberration in an otherwise noble system. Statues were smashed, names erased, decrees overturned. Rome wanted closure, not understanding. It wanted a villain it could destroy without questioning the world that had allowed him to rule unchecked. But Caligula's death did not undo what he had revealed. It only buried it deeper. The women taken into the palace did not suddenly regain their lives when the knives struck him down. Some never returned. Others emerged into a society that had no language for what they had endured. There were no trials, no inquiries, no acknowledgement. To speak of the garden, of forced rituals disguised as sacred duty, would have implicated senators, priests, and families who had chosen silence over resistance. So the survivors learned the final rule of Caligula's Rome. Survival required forgetting. Their suffering became invisible, absorbed into the marble walls that had witnessed it. What Caligula exposed was not just his own depravity, but the limits of Rome's moral spine. The empire prided itself on law, tradition, and divine order, yet it bent all three to accommodate one man's will. Ritual became a weapon. Religion became a shield. Honor became an excuse. None of this required madness. It required permission. Every red lantern placed at a doorway, every congratulatory message delivered to a terrified family, every historian who softened his words contributed to a system that transformed private horror into state practice. This is why Caligula's story unsettles historians even now. He was not an isolated anomaly. He was the logical outcome of absolute power layered upon unchallenged tradition. The Garden of Venus did not exist because Rome was corrupt. It existed because Rome was obedient. The empire had trained itself to accept cruelty as long as it arrived wrapped in ceremony and authority. When Caligula crossed boundaries, he did not invent new ones. He simply walked through doors that had already been left unlocked. Rome survived him, but it did not learn from him in the way it claimed. Later emperors refined the art of control, becoming quieter, subtler, more efficient. The lesson taken was not that power must be limited, but that excess must be hidden better. History followed the same path. By reducing Caligula to madness, it spared humanity from asking a more dangerous question. How many people, given the same unchecked authority, would have done differently? In the end, the garden was not destroyed. It dissolved into silence, absorbed into memory gaps and broken inscriptions. Its true cost cannot be measured in numbers or names, because Rome made sure those were lost. What remains is a warning written between the lines of history. When power answers only to itself, when fear replaces conscience, and when silence becomes survival, death is not the worst outcome. Being erased while still alive is far more efficient. And Rome, for a time, perfected that art. The truth Rome never wanted, remembered. Long after Caligula's name was scraped from stone and his likeness shattered, Rome convinced itself that the danger had passed. New emperors rose, laws were rewritten, and order returned to the streets. On the surface, the nightmare appeared contained, locked safely in the past, with the man blamed for it. But history does not forget as easily as empires hope. It waits. And what lingers after Caligula is not just the memory of a tyrant, but the uncomfortable realization of how willingly a civilization cooperated with its own moral collapse. The Garden of Venus was never rebuilt, yet its logic survived. Rome had learned that silence worked, that erasure was cleaner than justice, that the suffering of the vulnerable could be managed as long as it remained unseen and unnamed. The women who vanished from records did not simply disappear. They were removed because their existence threatened the story Rome wanted to tell about itself. An empire built on law could not admit it had legalized terror. A society obsessed with honor could not confront how easily it had traded daughters for stability. This is why the truth feels fragmented today, not because evidence is lacking, but because it was intentionally broken. The past we inherit is shaped as much by what was destroyed as by what was preserved. When historians piece together Caligula's reign, they are not reconstructing events alone. They are navigating layers of deliberate forgetting. Each missing name, each vague accusation, each sudden silence in the sources points to a shared decision made centuries ago. Some truths were too dangerous to survive intact. What makes this story endure is not its shock, but its familiarity. Caligula did not rely solely on violence. He relied on normalization, on the quiet understanding that resistance was futile and memory negotiable. Rome did not fall because of him. It adapted, and in doing so, it demonstrated a pattern humanity has repeated across cultures and centuries. When power becomes absolute, it rarely announces its worst acts openly. It ritualizes them, it sanctifies them, it teaches people to look away. The women of Rome paid the price for that lesson. Their lives were reduced to whispers, their suffering converted into gaps in the historical record. Yet those gaps speak loudly now. They tell us that history's greatest horrors are not always preserved in detail. Often, they are marked by absence, by the uneasy feeling that something essential has been removed. To study Caligula honestly is to accept that his crimes were not an anomaly, but a mirror held up to a society that chose survival over conscience. In the end, this is not only Rome's story, it is a warning carved into the margins of history. When fear becomes tradition, when silence becomes virtue, and when power goes unchallenged, cruelty does not need justification. It only needs permission. Rome gave it once, and the traces left behind remind us that the most dangerous chapters of history are not those we remember vividly, but those we were taught to forget.